misinformation and disinformation, we're studying mainly social media, right? Most of it is happening on social media. That doesn't mean that all of it is happening on social media. Surely there's also offline word of mouth, but yeah, pretty much any of the presentations today were on social media. So this again is on social media, and I'm going to talk about a few research projects over the last 5 years. So it started in 2019 when I started a PhD at UWA, and at that time, misinformation was something that people were, of course, aware of, specifically after the 2016 elections, but it was nowhere as prominent as it's now, right? Especially after COVID-19 and so on. Fake news and misinformation was a term that came up way more often than it did like in 2018 or 2019. Okay, up to the stage where now we're in 2024, and the World Economic Forum, for example, says that misinformation, disinformation, and polarization are among the greatest short-term risks to society today, even overlapping the risk of climate change in the short term. Okay. And when we think about social media, obviously there's many issues that we have with social media, and many issues that we have with misinformation. And there's many mechanisms that drive the sharing of misinformation. But of course, one of the issues is that we're just bombarded with information, right? And Tim spoke about attention, right? And just getting the message across, right? And that's basically what's happening on social media, that we just have so much information available. If we wanted to, we can just spend 24/7 just scrolling through social media and consume information, right? And then the question is, okay, how can we then know what is true and what isn't true, right? And the bigger question, of course, is that the question that we had earlier today is, okay, how do we even identify truth? Who gets to make that decision that something is true or isn't true, right? So those are, of course, big questions that we're probably not going to answer today, but that are part of that issue. And so I looked at misinformation in different contexts, and really the issue of misinformation happens in different contexts, right? So we have health, where during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was misinformation about cures to COVID-19, right? And then people ended up drinking chemicals and even dying from it, right? So one of the consequences of misinformation was death in that sense. Then we had wars. Oh, we still have wars going on where misinformation and disinformation play a role, whether that's Ukraine, Russia, or Israel, and so forth. And then, of course, most recently, elections, but even before that, we have many different elections where there's also misinformation, and it does have downstream effects, even though those downstream effects are, of course, not that simple. And you mentioned that earlier as well, where it's not like, oh, I'm going to put out misinformation and then people vote a certain way. That's not how it works, right? But there's definitely some consequences to it. So the first research project that I wanted to talk about is information sharing and political polarization on social media, the role of falsehood and partisanship. So that's an article that I published in Information Systems Journal. And it's 4 studies, and I'm going to go through those 4 studies in a bit. This is basically on misinformation and also extreme partisan information. And I'm going to define those in a minute. So we looked at extreme partisan information, and what we mean by that is information that may or may not be accurate, but contains extreme political views. So we don't know whether it's misinformation or not. It hasn't been fact-checked or anything, but we know that it somehow contains extreme political views. And then misinformation, which here is defined as false information that is spread regardless of intent to mislead. Again, when we collect the data, we didn't know whether those people who spread that information did it with malicious intent. So we can't necessarily say that it was disinformation. And then in terms of polarization, we looked at attitudes and attitude polarization, which is ideological segregation based on individuals' beliefs and attitudes. Okay, and the question that we had originally was, okay, misinformation and also extreme partisan information, are they more engaged with than their counterparts? So non-extreme partisan information or more moderate information, and also accurate information, okay? And we looked at sharing in that sense. So engagement here was measured by, okay, how many people actually shared it. And also then we followed up with experiments where we not only looked at social media sharing, but also, okay, people who get exposed to misinformation, how do they feel in response to it? So kind of their emotions, but also their attitudes. So, and I'm going to talk about this more in a second. But for example, if you have a certain attitude towards vaccines, right? After being exposed to misinformation, do you get more extreme in your attitudes? And that can be that you're against vaccines or that you're for vaccines, right? Same with extreme partisan information. We don't make the distinction necessarily between right or left, but just in general, extreme information. So study one was on Twitter. You can see that this data set is not recent because we could still access the Twitter API. So I think that data was collected 2021, around that time. So it had some COVID-19 information in there as well. And what we did is basically get tweets that were fact-checked from independent fact-checking websites, including, this is just an example, PolitiFact here, but there's other independent fact-checking websites, right? And then we collected those tweets that have been fact-checked and were either false or accurate, based on their ratings. And then we did textual analysis. So Louis22, that's just a tool for textual analysis. So there's been a lot of textual analysis research based on Louis, which basically has certain constructs. So for example, positive emotions, negative emotions, and comes up with scores based on text. And what we found, so that those were like thousands of tweets that got shared many, many times, so millions of times. And then we looked at, okay, if we look at accurate, those that have been fact-checked and were accurate versus those that have been fact-checked and were misinformation. And then also a control group, okay, just any type of information. What gets the most engagement? And we used a bunch of control variables, but I didn't want to bore you with all the models and stuff. So kind of what we found here was that misinformation was associated with higher rates of sharing than accurate information, and also with higher negative emotions than accurate information. And I specifically say here negative emotions in individuals, because I'm not saying that misinformation had themselves negative emotions necessary in them. That might have been the case, but we looked at the comment section. So we looked at, okay, if you have misinformation and then you go through the comment sections and you analyze those comment sections, and then you look at how negative are people in those comment sections, right? And kind of what we found here is in response to misinformation, the comment sections were a lot more negative than in response to accurate information. Okay. So that was the first study, social media field study. And then we followed that up with experiments, because from this, you don't necessarily know anything about their attitudes, right? Like you can't, from social media data, unfortunately, you can't ask those people who commented, okay, how did you feel in response to the misinformation, right? So that's why we followed up with experiments, and that was in a US context. So we surveyed or did an experiment with people who live in the US, and we exposed them as part of that experiments. We had different stimuli, exposed them to some kind of misinformation with different messaging, and also accurate information. Okay. And what we found in those experiments, and again, I'm not going to go into the specific models. You can read the paper if you want to get more details on the numbers and stuff. But what we found here is that misinformation, so people who got exposed to misinformation in those experiments, not only had higher negative emotions, so for example, anger, which kind of replicates what we found on in the field data, but also they led to higher levels of attitude polarization. So kind of when you get exposed to COVID-19, like let's say vaccine misinformation or abort or some other topics like gun control or abortion, right? You get more extreme in your opinion or in your attitudes about that context than if you get exposed to accurate information about it. And that can go, again, either way, whether you're pro-abortion pills or against abortion pills or pro-gun control, against gun control, right? So in general, that led to higher attitude polarization. And it also didn't matter whether that misinformation necessarily aligns with your views or not. So even if it aligns with your views, you do get more extreme in response to that misinformation. Okay, so that's what we found out in the first two studies. And then we focused on extreme partisan information. And once again, we don't know whether part of it might be misinformation, part of it might be accurate information. But we basically focused on information from different kind of media outlets, and we used different approaches to identify those as extreme partisan or not extreme partisan. One of those sources was the media bias chart, where you have a bunch of media outlets listed as left, right, based on the articles that they publish, based on surveys of what other people think about those media outlets, and so forth. So they have a certain method how they get that chart. So that was one source that we used. We also asked experts in the field what their opinion is. How would they rate those media outlets and whether they would be considered extreme or not. We also looked at political elites on Twitter and looked at, so this person is someone who is very liberal or very conservative, and what kind of media outlets do they follow, right? Back in the days, you could still do that with Twitter, with the Twitter API. You can check, this political elite follows 100 different media outlets, and what are those media outlets, right? So we also looked at political elites and what they follow, and then basically calculated a score and said, this media outlet can be considered left or extreme left or right, extreme right. And that kind of lined up with the media bias chart that we also found online. And then we basically did the same thing that we did with the misinformation data set. So we looked at, do extreme partisan information, or are they associated with higher rates of sharing than non-extreme partisan information? And also, are they associated with higher negative emotions? So stuff like anger, people in the comment sections more angry in response to that extreme partisan information. And pretty much the results mirror what we found with the misinformation data set. So yes, indeed, extreme partisan information was associated with higher rates of sharing than non-extreme partisan information. So the information that came from those extreme media outlets were more engaged and also more negative. People felt more angry. And this is kind of in line with what we talked about earlier in terms of echo chambers, right? Where people might be extreme, but also might be very negative. And then there's this feedback loop where they get more and more negative, right? And once again, we did an experiment. Then that was the last study of this project, where we wanted to find out, okay, is it just negativity or is it also polarization again? So does that negativity, them being angry in response to the extreme information, extreme partisan information, does that also then lead them to be more extreme in their attitudes towards certain topics like gun control and so forth, right? So we expose them to different types of information again, extreme partisan and non-extreme partisan information, and we find the same thing that we find with misinformation, right? That yes, if they felt more angry, they also got more extreme in their attitudes around the topic. Okay, so extreme partisan information not only leads or led to higher levels of negative emotions, but also to higher levels of attitude polarization. So that was one paper that we looked at. And then after that, we became more interested in, okay, what are some of the characteristics that make misinformation spread? So in the first paper, we found, okay, for example, negative emotions are one of the, like anger is what leads to more polarization, and anger is also what leads to more sharing. Okay. But then in the next paper, we looked at complexity, simplicity, kind of, and we measured that in terms of readability. So are misinformation usually more readable, simpler, and that's why they get picked up more? And then is that a reason why people engage more with that, with misinformation? And then at the end, we also wanted to find out, okay, is there something that we can do about it if that's the case? Okay, so given the amount and frequency at which we're exposed to information on social media and our tendency to go on autopilot, and with autopilot, I mean many people just scrolling through social media are not really reading anything. So there's a lot of research on how people share content without even having read the news article, right? Kind of going on autopilot. And which role does readability play here? And our idea here was less is more or less. So if people find more readable information, they're always going to go for that one. So basically, simple information gets shared more. But then the question is misinformation more readable than accurate information in the first place, right? If that's not the case, then it doesn't matter what readability does. So the first thing that we wanted to find out is, okay, if we look at misinformation, we analyze them, and then we look at accurate information based on fact-checking websites, right? What is the difference in readability? And this is kind of what I refer to as autopilot. So I guess some of you have heard about system 1, system 2 theory, right? Where, or any type of dual process theory that kind of says, okay, we have this one system or this one process where we react fast or process information in a fast way and make decisions fast in a subconscious and automatic and also emotional way. And system 2, which is more slow, conscious, effortful thinking, right? We also wanted to find out, okay, does that play a role here? Okay, sorry. So in terms of data collection, so this was not on Twitter. This one was on Facebook. So this is different social media platform. The first paper was on Twitter. This one here is on Facebook. And so that data set I got through a partnership with Social Science One, which is hosted by Harvard University. And they got me in contact with Meta. And then they provided me with data. And that data is called the URL shares data set. So basically, Facebook provided me with data on URLs that were shared more than 100 times on social media. So that's millions or I think the rows were like billions of data points, but of course, not everything is fact-checked, right? So I got it down to, okay, which of those URLs were actually distributed on Facebook and were fact-checked. So then you end up with like 1,000 or something like that, right? So specifically, we had 10,000 URLs that were fact-checked from individual fact-checking websites that Facebook is working with. And then we had those URLs that were fact-checked as either misinformation or accurate information. Then we looked at the posts that included those URLs, right? So we looked at the posts that were actually spreading misinformation or accurate information. And we used a tool called CrowdTangle to get those posts once we knew the URLs. I'm sure most of you are aware that CrowdTangle doesn't exist anymore. There's something called the Meta Content Library now, which I guess gives you a similar experience. I think more limited, but yeah, that's the new tool. But back in the days, it was CrowdTangle. So just so that you get an idea, on the left you have a Facebook post that might include misinformation, and then on the right you have one of those websites that were behind the URL, right? So you have a link to a news article, and then you have the actual news article. We didn't analyze the actual news article. This has been done by the fact-checking websites. They looked at those news articles and looked at whether it's misinformation or not. We only focused on the Facebook posts and the readability of those Facebook posts. By the way, I chose this Breitbart example, which is on the right, but I'm not saying that all misinformation or extreme partisan information is from the right. So I could have also, there's also media outlets from the left that were included in that data set, okay? So with that in mind, now that we had this kind of data, I think we had around 350,000 Facebook posts that got shared more than 10 million times throughout across Facebook. And we looked at first, okay, misinformation, is it more readable than accurate information? And what we found is that misinformation indeed tends to be more readable than accurate information. So, and readability was analyzed based on common readability measures. So there's research on textual analysis and on readability. Some of you might know the Flash score or ARI, Automated Readability Index, right? That looks at, okay, how simple is language in those posts? And we also looked again on engagement, and it's kind of what we found on Twitter. Misinformation was also associated with higher sharing than accurate information. Okay, so that was the first study where we now knew, okay, misinformation tends to be more readable than accurate information. The question then was, okay, first of all, do people actually, so we have this objective measure of readability, but do people actually perceive them as being easier to process? So if something is more readable, do I actually know that it is more readable? Do I perceive it as being easily processed? And so we looked at that, and we found that, so we did an experiment again with people from the US and exposed them to different kinds of misinformation. And later there was a disclosure that it was misinformation, so we go through ethics and stuff if you were concerned about that. So basically we showed them different misinformation posts and then looked at readability and whether they perceive those that are more readable as easier to process. And then if they perceive them as easier to process, are they more likely to share them or have the intention to share them on social media? And basically that's what we found, that, okay, more readable misinformation is perceived with higher levels of cognitive ease. So with cognitive ease, I mean, I think I perceive it as being more easily processed. And So with higher levels of cognitive ease to process than those that are less readable. Okay, so we kind of confirmed that this objective measure of readability, it's not only an objective measure of readability, but also people actually perceive it as being easier to process. And then we looked at, okay, does that lead to sharing intentions? And it does. So higher perceived cognitive ease leads to a higher likelihood to share the misinformation. And now this is where system 1, system 2 thinking comes in. So now that we know that people tend to go for something that is easier processed, right, or that they perceive as being more readable and easier to process, how does that affect their sharing decision, and how does it affect my natural ability to engage in critical thinking? How does that play a role here? So kind of, does it, for someone who has a natural tendency to engage in critical thinking, does it really matter to them how easy it is to process the information when they make their sharing decision? Because you would expect that if people are on social media, they share information because of the content, right? Not because, oh, it's easy to process or it's simple to read, right? You would hope so, which often is not the case, right? But we kind of looked at that, and what we found is a higher natural tendency to cognitive reflect, so to engage in system 2 thinking, weakens the effect of perceived cognitive effort on misinformation sharing intentions. So what that means is that, yes, usually something that is more easily processed, like if misinformation is more easily processed, it leads to higher sharing. But if I'm someone who's engaging in critical thinking, usually, then that doesn't matter as much anymore, okay? Perceived cognitive ease doesn't matter as much anymore in my sharing decision, and it shouldn't, right? So that's what we found, and system 2 and system 1 thinking played a role here, cognitive reflection. And the way that we measured cognitive reflection was with something called CRT, cognitive reflection test, which is often used in psychology as well, to measure cognitive reflection. So the last study, and this is like still early, we wanted to look at, okay, what can we do about it with this knowledge? So we were thinking, okay, now that we know that one issue is that people who don't engage in critical thinking, they try to use easy cues in the social media post. So they just go for whatever is simple, right? Or they might go for an image, or they make their sharing decisions based on those simple cues. So can we ask them, or can we prompt them to engage in system 2 thinking? And then does that lead to reduced sharing? Because we tell them, or we try to prompt them to engage in more critical thinking, right? And we basically, this is like very early stage, we just created like one social media ad, and like just wanted to have an initial look at, okay, how do people react to like these kind of prompts, right? So this is an example here. If they see the Facebook ad, for example, that says, think before you share. So it's not talking about misinformation. It's just telling them, okay, engage in critical thinking, think before you share. How does that affect then their sharing intentions, right? And what we found is when people read this intervention, it significantly mitigated people's intention to share the misinformation. So if they saw the intervention first and then misinformation, that reduced overall misinformation sharing. And what's more important is that people did not rely on perceived cognitive ease anymore. So basically, there was no effect of perceived cognitive ease anymore, or perceived cognitive effort, whatever you want to call it. Kind of saying that, okay, if people engage in critical thinking, they don't go for, their sharing decision isn't just based on, okay, is it easy, simple to process or not, right? But again, this is very early stage, and it's unknown what the long-term impact of those interventions is. I know that there's a lot of research and into interventions, pre-bunking, debunking, and showing that those interventions, for example, often just work for a day or 3, and then people go back to their normal behaviors, right? So take this with a grain of salt. But this is the idea behind that. Okay, if cognitive reflection plays a role here, is there a way for us to motivate people to engage in critical thinking more? And hopefully tomorrow, when we talk about combating the spread of misinformation, we have much more sophisticated, tools to motivate people to engage in critical thinking and make them more digital literate. So what's next? Obviously, to mitigate the spread of misinformation, we will need a lot more than just a simple intervention or just a simple Facebook ad or anything. And this likely will include pre-bunking, debunking, and just in general, a more digital literate society. So that's it pretty much from me. Thank you very much.
Yes, floor is open. Nice questions. It's just a simple question, really, about more often that when someone says it's a simple question, it ends up being not simple, torturous. But no, you talked about experimental, the experimental approach. So I know experiments are sort of like the gold standard for identifying causality. Yeah. But I often struggle with the idea of the kind of the experimental conditions. Like, oh, you've got to set. So I'd just like to hear a bit more about how you set the experiment up. Like with, for example, exposure to misinformation or exposure to partisan information. Is the people, are they sort of on a website and they're kind of going through social media posts that have been created for them, and they know it's an experiment. So I just sort of wonder about how kind of realistic it is, the conditions. But I understand that this is it's as I said, it's like a gold standard for identifying causality. I sort of get that. But I guess my other question is, are you aware of any sort of natural experiments that have been sort of leveraged in this context? I've got no idea what they might be, but I know that they're, it would just be interesting to know. So,
yeah. So that's 100% a valid point. That's like one of the shortcomings of the experiment. This is exactly that. Well, what's the external ratio of things, right? Like, would that hold up in a real world scenario? That's why ideally you want to do field experiments, and that's something that we wanted to do as well, specifically with like the last part of it, where it's about combating misinformation, right? Because this is just very early stage, just to get an idea of how people react to it, right? But ideally you want to do, like, if you can get some kind of field experiments, so for example, actually have run ad campaigns and see, okay, maybe for example we can collaborate with like some kind of non-profit organization and have them run ads with this kind of messaging and then see whether it actually works or not. That would be way better. Yeah. So I 100% agree with that. In terms of whether there is research out there that have done that, I don't know specifically on Facebook ads, but of course there's a lot of literature on, debunking and pre-bunking and people, using games where they get educated in those games, right? So I think there is definitely some kind of more natural field experiment out there that do inform us about whether this works or not. But it's limited because it's really hard to use those field experiments.
Yeah, it's expensive and Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, so unless you have a major grant that can actually do this, or you have the connections to social media platforms, it's always going to be some kind of either experiment like this, or an experiment where you do you can make the effort and actually set up your own social media environment to make it a little bit more authentic, right? At least it's not completely an experiment where it's just a survey, but you pretend to have obviously you would need someone to code this, and I know that some people did that, like they code their own social media platform, and then they participate in those experiments, where it's like so it's still a fake social media environment, more natural.
Yeah.
There's one example, the infamous emotional contagion Facebook experiment in 2012.
Yeah.
They modified the tenor of the feed of some people, but without telling them. So that was very helpful. And it kind of caused a bit of a stir, but they tried to polish it. It was completely against the most basic process, but they thought it was cool. That's when people started thinking, maybe Facebook isn't such a great thing after all. It's something to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually referring to a natural experiment rather than that's a field experiment.
Yeah.
And it would be unethical. Yeah, I mean, a natural experiment. Yeah, and I have no idea about whether there is one or where something's happened that has meant that people have been exposed to kind of changes in conditions, but it's actually a result of not something that the researchers set up, but I've seen it in other contexts, but not in this one.
And what is called difference in difference model.
Exactly.
Yeah, those kind of models where you have a certain event, and then you can get to almost causality with different kinds of models. But I haven't seen that in this context where it's like, or there was this huge government campaign, and then let's analyze before and after, right? Like that would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And probably that's actually the way forward, where if we have more of these campaigns through more digital literate society, or like to counter misinformation, and we can also study it more. But once again, that requires access to those platforms.
Yeah.
Just to follow on, how did you recruit? I think you said that from the US for the experiments, and like were they representative of any particular population?
Well, not too many requirements, but just active social media users. So not someone who's never used social media in their life. Not necessarily national representative sample, because social media sample in itself is biased, right? Where not everyone, like social media space isn't necessarily reflective of the nation, right? So we use panel provider who prolific in that case to get us basically US response, and then we control for factors like demographics, age, ideology, and this kind of thing. Yes.
In political advertising, the same principle appears to be, so that people remember or are more affected by aggressive advertising than my other advertising. But I had a point entirely differently on the other side of the coin. During the pandemic, the various people on social media said, "Oh, why aren't the government using social scientists, etc., etc.?" Which I said, "Well, why aren't you using advertising agencies?" Because they really did not systematically get their positive message across. Because it's advertising agencies who know that they're the experts in speaking to people, and not social scientists.
Yeah. Yeah, I think advertising plays a huge role.
So can I go back to that concept of readability?
Yeah.
Interesting. Can you explain a little bit on why you think misinformation is more readable and more misinformation, and what's your, how does it link to emotion and outrage, which are also important parts of misinformation and why people react to it? So are these sort of linked, or are they different kind of aspects of misinformation compared to
Yeah, so first paper was basically more about the emotional part. So there we looked not at readability, but just in general, does misinformation make people, exposure to misinformation make them more angry, for example, or is it framed in a way basically to appeal towards certain emotions, right? And if that's the case, you know, if it's emotionally manipulative, then does that lead to more sharing? The second one, we didn't look at emotion at all. While we controlled for it, we did analyze, okay, how positive was the misinformation, like the post, right? Or how negative was the post? But that wasn't, we didn't run a model where we had, okay, more positive misinformation, like more positive information leads to more sharing or whatever. But I think if I remember right, when we did find that on average, misinformation wasn't only more readable, but also more negative. So we did, I think, find that, but we only focused on the readability part. And the readability part was, yeah, as I said, like an objective measure where it just looks at, okay, like sentence lengths and all that kind of whatever the formula is that the literature has said, okay, that captures readability the best. And it captures how would someone speak that is in grade 5 versus grade 7 or grade 8, right? And then whatever score it gives me, that's how I then identify, okay, out of all the misinformation that we post that we have and all the accurate information posts that we have, okay, what has the higher readability score or not? So yeah, that's how we measured it, and that's what we focused on in this paper. But there's obviously other factors that drive misinformation sharing. So we only identified readability as one. So we then want to create basically ads or whatever it is, some kind of, we want to combat misinformation, specifically talking about readability or critical thinking, right? But another approach would be to also talk about emotions, for example. And I know that there has been work done from Ecker, for example, or also from Van der Linden from Cambridge University in terms of pre-ranking, for example, where they say, okay, these are the 5 characteristics of misinformation that are most used, and that might be, for example, having higher readability, and that might be being more emotional or being more negative. And the idea then is to tell people, okay, when you see information on social media, can you be aware of those characteristics? Be aware that if it's very emotional, maybe it's not accurate information, right? Maybe they just try to convince you of something. And same with, I guess you can't make the same argument with readability just because something is simple. Yeah. This is too readable, but I guess you can go towards critical thinking in general and don't just share it because you think, oh, it's simple to read or not to read, right? Like because there is, what we found here is that there is this notion that misinformation is usually designed that it is more readable and that it might be shorter, right? So you shouldn't just engage with information just because it's short. You might be better off with only consuming less, but in a more engaging way, right? But anyways, that's not what we tested here. You're right.
The extra word you need for readability is simplified language.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You're fired, lock them up.
Yeah,
simplified language.
Exactly. So that's like initially.
Even sentence length and aggression.
But it isn't just language, that's the thing, because I think it's really, spreading this information, much easier for the complex issues to just have these false narratives that So, you know, it's kind of a known virus, right? COVID is a really complex thing. We didn't actually know what was happening for a long period there. So if somebody comes in, here you go, I've got it all for you in a really simple message. So I'm wondering, you know, is it just about language? Because you've got an unfairness around immediately spreading crap, because you don't have to be true to the complexity of the situation. You can just have a very simple, I guess, message, but also it's about saying about the country, right?
I mean, the reason why we have so many researchers working on this is because it isn't that simple, right? It isn't one content characteristic. It's multiple different content characteristics. And one of them is language being short versus long, maybe using buzzwords, maybe using capital letters versus no capital letters, right? You know, someone, those clickbait headlines, right? All that kind of stuff. So that's one dimension, content characteristics, but then it's also the user characteristics. So what is my ideology and all of that? So I definitely can't claim, oh, it's readability or anything, right? So that's definitely just one thing that we looked at. And a lot of this debunking and debunking work also doesn't say, okay, this is the one thing that we need to educate people about. They usually have different messages. They say, okay, readability is one thing, simple messages or language is one thing. Emotionality, getting emotionally involved, is another thing, right? So they come up with 10 different messages and say like, okay, you need to check out for that. But I guess that comes then with its own problems, because if you overwhelm people, you want to educate people about misinformation and their characteristics, but then if you have 10 different messages, they are also going to be overwhelmed, and they're going to be like, okay, what is it that I'm actually looking for when I'm trying to identify misinformation, right?
I mean, I think emotional triggers are a better indicator than readability. I mean, I haven't thought about it, but it could be that some content is accurate but readable, whereas the use of an emotional trigger, which can be language, which can be music, can be ad hominem attacks, as long as it, you know, that's something it's generally, you know, why they're doing that. It's a good trigger to reflect on that. Readability could be advertising, you know, so many different things. I think the use of emotion is that's what we bring.
Like, yeah, that's, I think, the stronger one for sure. Like, if we look at different content characteristics, then emotion, I think, is one of the strongest indicators in our theory. That's probably the one that we need to educate most about. Like, even that we showed that picture earlier with like stuff like that, right? Like, whether it's emotional music or like this cool emotional picture, right, where someone is.
That's true, but like, how much is it emotion and how much is it like social signaling? You know, like, because you looked at like sharing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like a question that I have is like, you know, if you come across some kind of like misinformation, which we would call misinformation, like about drinking bleach or something.
Yeah.
You know, like the motivation to share that could be okay. Definitely explain it by emotional content or how readable it is, like definitely. But I guess like another thing is, you know, me sharing that, if I have a conviction that the government has been suppressing my freedoms, I have a like, you know, I have a belief that actually is operationalized. You know, I can't come back from that. Just sharing it, you know, it may not have anything to do with belief. It might actually be, I need to signal to my in-group that I'm on the same team as them. You know, like, is that, do you think that might potentially have something to do with the sharing, like the determinant of sharing?
It's sort of, like, I think it's usually called confirmation bias. Like, I have a system of beliefs, this fits in, so it's a key thing that is lead to action. And it's, maybe it's more challenging than the emotion one, I'm sure it is actually.
Well, like that AI generated image, you know, it's like, okay, it's fake. And obviously that's quite a lot different than the kinds of even knowing that it's not a real girl, you know, you'll say, I'm going to share it anyway, because I reckon the female didn't do a good enough job during, you know, Hurricane Katrina, whatever it was. Because it's not about.
I still think that's a very small percentage of people who say, I don't care, actually don't care about, not on the post-truth side. I still think that's true, but I think that's a very small portion of people who go, I actually don't care.
Yeah.
I think that's.
I mean, there's definitely,
Terrifying.
there's definitely studies that that huge part of sharing is also the status, right? And like me wanting to communicate with other people, and also them getting then shares and likes themselves, right? Which then boosts their ego, like, oh, I'm sharing something that other people find helpful. And a lot of people then also might say, oh, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I'd rather share it just in case.
Yeah.
You know, to let my friends know about it or something like that. So that is definitely sometimes the narrative that there's definitely research that there's, you can attribute some sharing to that particular reason, which is like, yeah, the social component of it and how people react to it.
Can I ask a very quick thought? Sorry.
Yeah, on the discussion of AI related images and features, the going on, 2 weeks ago, probably a month ago, there was an image all eyes in Rafa, where the Rafa was being attacked by the Chinese forces. Was the AI created, which everybody knew that the image created by AI, and people shared it with conscience. They were widely circulated image, just written all eyes in Rafa. Knowing well that the image created by AI, because it was clearly not like this image that we shared recently with a girl who looks like they are going BMK, but in that it was clearly an image and was being shared. And one aspect of it was that probably the image should not be shared because it hides what is actually happening at Rafa, because it was very sanitized, it was just like clear buildings and clear pictures, and then written on top of that, what I think rather the actual images that were coming out from Rafa were not being shared at the same time, because they were much more brutal. Just wanted to add that point to this whole discussion of creative and sharing them, whether knowing or not knowing, because everybody knew that it was and still being shared quietly. But the belief that it is going to help people know more about how. It's such an important discussion in the human rights sector, and we have those, witness of human rights activist organizations, taking a really strong position saying so vital that human rights defenders do not, in desperate times, exploit these moments, use AI, be part of this misinformation game, because it has these really terrible long-term consequences in terms of trust. And but I get that tension when people are like, whatever it takes. I'm absolutely desperate, but the long-term harms of losing any kind of trust from audiences, and I think it is really problem. So really interesting to go into it.
Love this, thank you so much. So I have a couple questions from here, because I think a similar project, but it's not experiment. So the first question is, which CRT would you use the original 3D question one?
I use I tried different ones and worked with.
The three.
Well, it worked with CRT1, CRT2, which is, so CRT1 was the 3 questions, then there's a non-numerical one, which is CRT2. I also did that just to control for that as well. Yeah.
No, that's great. So I can do that in mind. I'm basically just a 3 question. It's very numerical, and it has been shown consistently that it's biased. So apparently we were bad at that. I also feel that.
Yeah, so you can do CRT, then non-numerical, so they don't need to know numbers. And then also there's the construct need for cognition that you can also look at, which isn't necessarily cognitive reflection, but it captures, okay, is someone generally interested into complex problems and likes to think? So that's NFC, need for cognition. And that's similar. So that's not a test, that's more of a normal scale where it's like, okay, tell me, do you like to think? Like, it's not that simplistic, but
Did you have any demographic as well? From your experiment?
I mean, I had age, gender,
Yeah.
race, and this kind of stuff, but I didn't analyze it in detail. So they were more of control variables, but I didn't map out exactly, okay, gender, like I didn't map out the differences. Yeah.
I'll
So
quickly share one and see that like found ideas. I did like a experiment looking at the interaction between political preference and CRT.
Mhm.
And looking at political news that have been captured by ABC or infiltration.
Mhm.
And it's small, so it's public, it's 150 respondents of Australia.
Mm.
And the political preference are either, I know I only did the economy because I doubt I didn't have time, but I only did either neutral, but I mean like neutral labor or liberal. And ask about sharing.
Yeah.
As well. So we actually did find that people who were scoring high in CRT, so people with smart, when it's news that aligns with political views, they switch. So basically, their political preference trump their intelligence. So is that, you're talking about system 1, system 2 thinking. So they were on system 2, if they're smart, and they could be analytical. But as soon as the fake news is aligning with their political interests, they switch to system 1. And that's significant for both pro-liberal, pro-labor. But the sharing one was interesting because, like, over in my group, this is people want to share political news. And I don't know if that's just the political culture of people in Australia. They don't like to know their political views on people versus Americans, maybe more likely or not, but there was just not enough data. People just said, no, I don't want to share. And it got me thinking about sharing being very different from, well, I think there's this research coming up about this sharing behavior is very different from believing. Regardless of what you believe, your decision to share is a whole other decision.
Oh yeah.
It's not the system wants to do, it's another decision altogether.
Yeah.
And it may be a whole range of things like who's on your social, whatever. So I know I'm just going, I haven't published it, I just did it with my friend who was a psychologist, and we did it on like random publication. But yeah, just throw it out there.
Well, I think that's good points. First of all, that sharing is different to belief, right? So, and that's going towards your point. Okay, some kind of sharing might also be independent from that just shares it because because of that social aspect, right? And yeah, that's why it's a good idea. Like if you do experiments, then also ask them about the belief. So I didn't do that, I think, back in the days, but with my new experiments, I'm doing that. Like I'm not only about asking about sharing, but also, okay, do you actually believe in misinformation or not, right? So because that's independent from sharing. And I think also interesting what you find, and I don't know whether there's research on it or whether we need more research on that you found, okay, kind of this ideology doesn't matters more, like critical thinking doesn't matter at some point anymore, because if we then try to educate people about this and like tell them, okay, engage in more critical thinking or whatever, the question is, will ideology override that, right? So can we effectively tell people to engage in more critical thinking, and what is the long-term impact of that? And also, okay, how does ideology play a role here? Yeah. So
there's a psychology term about like I think I need to talk about this lazy thinking.
Yeah.
People just got lazy because it's the information that aligns with their views anyway, so they don't bother to switch the system because it's easier
Hmm.
to digest. And
Yeah.
it's kind of the whole you're holding about readability.
Yeah.
Right? In the readability, it's like that's familiar to me, and I'm too lazy to think too hard about this now.
Mm.
So I'm not gonna keep my critical thinking now.
Yeah.
I've got somewhere to go, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much more. interesting. Well, I have a boring question, which I'll ask second. So just moving on this, like, discussion. I mean, if you look at like ideology, for example, and then think about like critical thinking, to what extent is someone who is ideologically driven, whether like some of this stuff, to what extent are they actually engaging in a form of rationalization? It's just rationalizing it within the framework of their ideology. You know, and I guess I'm just throwing it out as a kind of question around, you know, when you look at like the literature on conspiracy theories, for example, and so much profiling is being done on conspiracy theories, what's driving them, a lot of demographic stuff, a lot of social aspects and things like that. And it's like, well, there's a perspective there where the, you know, what we think of as conspiracy theorists are actually engaged in like their own version of critical reasoning. I'm not saying that it's legitimate, but you know, they're assessing evidence, weighing it up.
Well, there's a great article in MI, you know, about how they like fans.
Yeah.
I think one of your two Australian women, you know, about Britney Spears, like they're passing repertoires and they're sharing in community. It's very similar to the behavior of fans who accumulate expert knowledge and then share it with their community. So they were trying to see what the positive aspect of theorizing was. So
yeah. So that was, I mean, yeah, I guess I was just like toying with this idea of like, like rationality. Like it might be rational under a certain framework to share a post about like drinking bleach. You know, not because you believe it can work, but because everyone else who's like you is doing it.
Strengthening the position.
That's right. And so you want to promote that, you want to get it out there, not because of belief, but because of conviction. Yeah, and I guess, I don't know. So I'll ask the other question, which I think is a bit more pointed. I guess in your design, did you look at like you have like misinformation as a sort of aggregate sort of variable there, and did you break it down by like the different types? So you know, did you analyze sort of how the determinants by the type of misinformation? So for example, health versus political, or electoral politics versus say issue-based politics. Like, is there something you can say about the strength of like how emotions play or like readability plays in say politics versus like so I just feel like maybe I was just curious to hear if you have anything to say about there's different sort of domains of misinformation. Yeah.
So we didn't look specifically at that. So paper one, which was not about readability, but about the negative emotions and actually polarization, that was just, well, the field study would had a lot of COVID in there because of during the time it was that, and then the experiments was also about COVID, not necessarily about vaccines, but just in general response of the government and anything that had to do with COVID. So there was no different topics, so we couldn't do that there. With the second paper, I think that one was all kinds of different types of misinformation, because we just looked at what has been based on the data set that was given to us. What was fact check and what is misinformation. Things we didn't do then the topic analysis and check like out of those 300,000 posts, what are they actually on? I would assume that majority of one things COVID, but we didn't do that distinction because then obviously you play around moderators and different type of context. And it's certainly possible, like if you look for keywords or like do a keyword analysis or topic analysis, we just haven't done that.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I can't talk about the differences by topic.
Sure. Yeah. So I feel like with COVID, became politicized, and I was just really curious to like see to what extent, you say, for example, that you have that coded for data according to whether it's been fact checked or not, or yes, it's a true or false sort of variable or something. Yeah. And it seems to me that like maybe if somebody knows that like this topic, like drinking bleach is politicized, and basically, Trump said it, MAGA Republicans believe it, and I know that they're all trying to like suppress the truth and fact check this, like that could be in some ways determinate as well. Did you look at it from that perspective, like that if it is likely to or has been fact checked, it's almost like that would be maybe another variable alongside ability, emotion, etc. That you like, okay, cool.
Yeah, that I think that came up at some point when we were talking about the next project, because obviously fact check information already has a bias. Like but the problem is we don't know what it is. Like so there's some bias in what gets fact checked and what doesn't get fact checked, right? So by that alone, if it gets fact checked, there needs to be like something about it, right? Because if it's just any type of like individual fact checking website, they don't have time to just check everything, right? So that in itself already creates bias. And I think one thing to think about is, of course, what you mentioned, right? It's a narrative, it's something that gets picked up by the media or whatever. There's some people who do believe it, or some people who don't believe it, but still spread it anyway for the reasons that you mentioned. Yeah. So definitely there's something to it, but it's just hard for us to capture in a field study, right? Yeah. So that would be probably an experiment where you ask, like, you don't look necessarily at results, just in general, you expose them to different types of misinformation and then ask people for what reasons they share the misinformation, right? And one of those reasons might be just to mess with the other side or really, violence. But yeah, we didn't look at that either. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I get to that only because of what because of what you did get to. It's like, okay, emotion and readability are important. So I guess like, yeah, that's why I asked the question. But I felt like, oh, okay, it's interesting, and then how much of those moderated potentially by politicization that when you go deeper. Sorry, deeper.
Oh, I was just gonna jump in on that, because you mentioned one of the iterations could be debunked, right? And so there's been work with your science that debunking efforts based on types of like repressive types, and they broke it down to 7 different types, like political science, health, business, finance, whatever. So the quickest one to debunk was finance and business news, and the slowest one to debunk is political.
Yeah. Yeah, because of ideology.
Sometimes the real numbers of people, like, probably we don't understand, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds right, they just believe whatever debunk information, but political news on the other hand, it takes much longer for the debunking efforts to be effective.
Susan, can you hear me?
Yes. I've just got a question. In the context of the struggle with the government that they've had with the Australian government in trying to take down orders of content on platform X, In that context, let's say that in a longitudinal sense with your research, the prompts sound really promising to me in perhaps being effective to encourage digital literacy and critical reflection. My question is, say if it's found to be highly effective, have you thought how these interventions could be adopted on highly resistant platforms such as X, and whether we maybe need to consider getting the Safety Commissioner involved, because I know that, you know, that was met with a level of, well, a lack of success. So I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts about that, and whether this sort of research could be woven into our terms and conditions of platform engagement as a country?
Thank you very much, Susan. I think that's a brilliant question. So yeah, it's really hard to, well, first of all, we don't know whether it's effective or not, right? But let's just assume it is effective. Then we don't know how effective it is depending on the source, and that's actually something that I want to do now in future research. Is okay, ask people, like, have one or two interventions and then look what role does source characteristics play. So is it going to be more effective if a politician brings out that intervention on their own feed, or is it more effective if the government brings it out, or is it more effective with a non-profit organization, right? So what I had in mind was kind of like, okay, there is non-profit organizations that have Facebook websites or on Twitter or whatever, right? And they could obviously naturally post that on their feeds. We don't know what kind of effect that would have, but that would be one way. Then there would be another way where it's more like Facebook ads, right? Like as an NPO, you can also run ad campaigns. But once again, we don't know how effective it is depending on the source, and whether it's best to come from the government, non-profit organization, or there's a lot like, yeah, like the next thing that I wanted to say is like influencers, right? Because there's a lot of research how influencers were being used for political campaigning, right? So then the question is, okay, can we use influencers to do the opposite? But then is that the right thing to do? I don't know. I don't necessarily have an answer to that question. But of course, like we need to think about who is most effective in doing this, and then how does that relate to TNCs and, you know, the platforms. But I think what's the most unlikely is that the platforms themselves are going to put out, like, I don't know, information centers or like web pages on digital literacy where they say all of those different things, or that they themselves put some kind of prompts on their platforms that say this. I think that's, I don't know how effective that would be and whether they would even do that in the first place. I think
Australia has laws about using a carriage service to threaten, harass, abuse, etc. Those laws could be turned into applying false information.
Yeah.
Preferably done in association with the EU. You start off with $1 million fine, and that's paid by Facebook. If you do not actually take the material down, you move the fine to $10 million. If they don't take it down again, you move to $100 million. Now, Zuckerberg is only concerned about money, but it's really is a matter of the law. We have an unregulated sort of, you know, wild cow yard out there, and it's a matter of government regulation. And I think that the Safety Commission has been working with the EU. It's the EU also, which is most where the Americans have got all these crazy freedom of information laws, you know, where you can't stop anything.
Hmm.
It would be a matter of several countries and would, basically heavyweight fines, not about the individual page, but to the characters. Facebook or LinkedIn publishing stuff like McCulloch and other crazy anti-vaccine people. Basically that was the ideal solution.
Yeah.
If a government is strong enough to do
I think, yeah, that those are basically two separate discussions in terms of, okay, what can we do about it? And then the other question is how effective would it be, right? Like, and I agree, I think one thing is laws, right? Like enforcing platforms to implement or like care about that kind of stuff. And they only will care about it once you have like fines like this, right? Once it's about money. But then the other question, that's what I mentioned previously, is okay, how effective is it if it comes from the platform themselves? How effective is it if an influencer does it? Or how effective is it if a nonprofit organization does it, right?
They've introduced, I think it was after last year, maybe before if you could have a link to a news story or an article or something outside the platform, if you retweet it or people link and
Then
that's a form of, restraint that the platform has introduced, so they can, do this.
yeah, I read about that where you like